Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and today we are taking a look at maximum resistances, how to go over the regular in-game Path of Exile cap on your resistances, and why it is so darn effective. For those of you that are new to the channel, go ahead and like, subscribe, and ding the bell if you're interested in more video discussions just like this one. Those of you who are veterans of the channel, you of course know the way things work around here. There are timestamps placed above my slightly balding forehead for your convenience. So if at any point in time you'd like to jump ahead or revisit any of our talking points today, you can do so at your convenience. And of course, all of our sources and citations are going to be placed down below in the video description for your convenience. So a couple of definitions for us today as we take a look at maximum resistances and how to really min-max maximum resistances. First off, when we're talking about more maximum resistances, what we are talking about is a percentage figure that goes above the coded regular cap at 75% of elemental resistances. In Path of Exile, you have a cap at every single difficulty at 75%. Now we're going to call that a soft cap on your more maximum resistances because there are ways to push it over, to push your elemental resistances over that cap of 75%. And when we're talking about more maximum resistances, that's what we're referring to. We're referring to going over that soft cap of 75%. That's different and distinguishable from overcapping resistances. When we talk about overcapping your resistances, we mean that that is a percentage figure displayed in parentheses on your character sheet in-game in Path of Exile, and that accounts for the amount of elemental resistance that you have in surplus to the regular cap of 75% elemental resistance. You can almost think of it like an overflowing cup. If you fill up a cup with water and it's overflowing, right? If you leave it underneath the tap and the water is overflowing out of the cup, this is overcapping your resistances. They are not always useful, but they have specific uses when it comes into play. And that is going to mostly be in relation to elemental weakness or elemental curses that get placed on your character. Speaking of which, that's our third definitional term, elemental weakness. When we say that today during this discussion, we're referring to a curse that at a level 20 reduces your elemental resistances by 39% and is removed from surplus resistances, if you have any, right? And that removes from your surplus before your actual capped resistances at 75%. So the reason why you would want to overcap your resistances is in order to take account for things like elemental weakness. Most of the time, elemental weakness doesn't come into play at 39% effectiveness. Most of the time, it's actually at 34% effectiveness, and that'll be a number for you to remember. We're going to quiz you on it later on in the video, so remember that number of 34%. Moving on to talk about some ways to maximize your resistances to push over that cap of 75%. There are, of course, several different ways to do this inside Path of Exile. Now, sources of just resistances in general, you can get them on items, you can get them on the passive tree, you can get them on bandits like Illyra, you can get them on gems as well, right? When you're talking about the purity of elements, that is a gem that gives you simply all elemental resistances, but it doesn't push you past the max cap. It doesn't push you past the 75%. There are a few ways to go past the 75% soft cap. One of them, of course, is through itemization, which we've got an example item right here, which is called Saphel's Frame. It is a kite shield. That's the base that it is built off of. It's a relatively cheap shield. I believe right now, at least in Blight Hardcore and Softcore, it's going for like less than a few C. I want to say it's like 1 C is the cheapest version. Of course, that always depends on given day and time, but generally it's about a 1 C unique, and depending on the rolls, it's not expensive at all. And you can see on Saphel's Frame, first off, its implicit is just +4 to all elemental resistances. Okay, nothing really to write home about. It gives you a chance to block spell damage. Okay, that's somewhat niche, but again, nothing to really write home about. It gives you some increased spell damage, which is nice if you're using spells, but totally wasted if you're, say, a summoner or if you're using an attack-based character. And then it gives you +10 to all elemental resistances. So between this particular specific affix as well as the implicit, you get +14 to all elemental resistances, which is okay, but you could just roll +16 on another piece of gear as a tier 1 all elemental resistance. So it's really not great in the all elemental base resistance that it gives you. But what makes it stand out is that it also gives you plus 4% to all maximum resistances. So your maximum resistance, the moment that you equip a Sapphire's Frame, goes from 75% at the normal max cap to your maximum resistances are now 79%. We'll get into some of the numbers and why that's such a big deal. Though many of you out there right away are already looking at Sapphire's Frame and saying, yeah, but Iron, this doesn't have any life on it. It doesn't necessarily have any flat damage that gets added, and the armor isn't great off of it. You're absolutely right. It doesn't have any of those things. And so we're actually going to take a look at some instances of why and when it is important and necessary to consider whether or not you ought to push for more life on your build or whether or not you ought to push for more maximum resistances, depending on which is cheaper for you. Sapphire's Frame is a very, very cheap way to do this. Another more expensive or potentially inexpensive way of capping or overcapping your maximum resistances through the pushing of your max resistances past 75% is on the passive tree. There are 3 specific passive nodes on the tree that simply give you great resistances in the form of either fire, cold, or lightning resistance. The first, of course, is Barbarism, which gives you 1% to maximum fire resistance. The second is Survivalist, which gives you +1 maximum cold resistance. And the third is Unnatural Calm, which gives you +1 to maximum lightning resistance. Now, this might be fantastic for those of you that are pathing throughout the tree and are already close to Barbarism, Survivalist, or Unnatural Calm. But since we've got oils that we can now anoint our amulets with in Path of Exile Blight League, you may be interested to know that you can, of course, acquire these passives for the low, low price of some of the most expensive combinations right now in all of the league. And that is because they're very, very valuable. They can save you several different passive points by anointing your amulet rather than choosing to move your passive tree over towards Barbarism, towards Survivalist, or towards Unnatural Calm. Barbarism at the moment is anointed via opalescent oil, and a golden oil. Survivalist is anointed via golden oil, azure oil, and crimson oil. And Unnatural Calm is anointed by golden oil, and then verdant oil. So those are some pretty expensive oils if you are looking to anoint something. And then, of course, one that I didn't include in this particular image is simply the Soul of Steel passive, which is the most expensive passive possible, I believe, in terms of the oil anointments. I believe it's a double golden oil, if not triple golden oil. And it gives you just +1 maximum resistances to elemental resistances across the board. So that's +1 fire, +1 cold, and +1 lightning. Very, very valuable. If you're anywhere close to the tree to get it, then you're going to grab it. Otherwise, it's going to cost you anywhere between, I believe it's 10 to 12x, depending on which trade league you are in order to trade for the golden oils that are necessary to go and anoint something with Soul of Steel, which is another fantastic way to maximize your resistances. Lastly, of course, are gems. There is Purity of Fire, Purity of Ice, and Purity of Lightning. Each of those gems has a chance to give you, depending on the level of the gem, between 0 to 4% maximum resistances on the gem. That's nothing to sneeze at. Yes, of course, it does cost you mana reservation, but it's nothing to sneeze at. And again, we're going to get to those calculations right now to see exactly how effective it is to actually scale up your maximum resistance past the cap of 75%. So how much mitigation is it really? This is a post, thanks so much to White Sushi. It will be linked down below. This was a Reddit thread that he put together about a year ago on effective HP and how much the scaling of maximum resistances actually would impact the amount of damage that your character is scheduled to take when you take a hit. So, effective HP to elemental damage. He writes, so now that we've examined the effect of maximum resistances on damage taken, we want to take a look at it from a different perspective, a perspective where this damage mitigation actually matters. So I suppose this section will be a bit more effective in demonstrating the importance of even the most minute increases to maximum resistances. So let's say we have a player who has 3,000 HP and 75% maximum resistances. As such, he will have an effective HP of 3,000 HP or equal to 12,000 spell damage is what he'll be able to take. This essentially means that he will be able to avoid getting one shot by spells dealing up to 12,000 damage. That's because, of course, he's mitigating 75% of it, right? That's the assumption here. For those of you that are getting lost in the math, just realize if you're able to effectively mitigate 75% of the damage that's dealt and you have 3,000 HP, well, this is how we're getting to this number. Now, if he obtains more elemental resistances, we actually notice an exponential increase to his effective HP as seen in the image here. The image that he displays in the thread is then posted next to it here in our display today. Here's the partial table for easier reference. So when you are capped at 75%, you can have an effective HP to take an amount of damage that is up to 12,000. However, once you push to 76% max resistance, that's essentially a 4% increase. Now, the differences here, depending on each percentage of overcapped, it changes, it fluctuates a little bit, right around 4%. So later on in the video, when we review, 4% is really the percentage that you're going to want to keep in mind. Basically, each one single percentage above 75 that you go is another 4% damage that gets mitigated. So at 76, his effective HP allows him to take a hit up to 12,500. At 77, max resist, he can go up to 13,000. At 78 resist, he can go up to 13,600. And at 79%, he can go up to 14,286 damage taken before he's going to get one shot. The reason why 79 is a magic number, remember that we went over Saphel's Frame, which is very, very easy to get to, and it gives you +4 maximum resistance. And then, of course, remember that the purity gems can go up to 4%. They can go from 0 to 4% in terms of their maximum resistances that they give you in their respective elements. So if you were using the appropriate gem, or maybe using all of the appropriate gems in this circumstance, or if you're using Saphel's Frame, you're no longer sitting at 75% resistances, you're now sitting at 79%. And that's a significant amount of damage that is getting mitigated. It's essentially a 19% increase in the effectiveness of a single hit that you're able to take and the amount of mitigation that you are actually laying out every single time you're getting hit. So he writes, as you can see, the same player with 3,000 HP will be able to survive up to 15,789 elemental damage with 81% maximum resistances. And then from the rest on there, most of what he writes is relatively obsolete because we don't have maximum resistance flasks anymore. But I will simply say, if you are able to use a Saphel's Frame or use the appropriate purity gem for the content that you're interacting with, that puts you from 75 to 79. If you then get one of the particular available passives on the tree, which is Barbarism, or let's say Unnatural Calm, or let's say Survivalist, that puts you at 80%, and then let's say you get Soul of Steel, that puts you at 81%. So it's not unreachable. It is totally reachable with passives on the passive tree, or anointments that you could potentially get, and a combination of items, anointments, and the passive tree usage, as well as gems. You can get there depending on which is cheapest and, of course, which is most effective for you. Now, the thing to remember here and the thing to really appreciate about effective HP and resistances is some simple numbers. At 5,000 HP with 75% resistances, that's the same amount of tankiness as if you only had 4,000 HP but had 80% resistances. If you had 6,250 HP with 75 resistances, you would be just as tanky as somebody, or in terms of taking a hit, you'd be just as tanky as somebody who has 5,000 HP at 80% resistances. You can go around and mess around with the numbers and come up with all sorts of different scenarios to see, is it more effective for me to go and purchase an upgrade that maybe will give me 100 or 200 or 300 more life, or is it more effective for me to maybe rework my tree and go grab another 1 to 2% maximum resistances on the tree, because it might actually turn out that more maximum resistances will be more effective for you elementally speaking. This isn't taking into consideration chaos damage or physical hits or degens, but simply for the purposes of elemental damage, it might be more effective for you to get more maximum resistance than just more flat HP or more flat energy shield. So the question for you with your build today is, which is easier or cheaper for your build? To either go out and get another maybe 5% resistances onto your max, or to get another 1k plus HP, depending on what your thresholds and what your level of HP is already at. Sometimes it can be very, very expensive and very, very costly on the passive tree to try and get that much more HP. Sometimes it can be very, very costly to try and go get that much more elemental resistances. So you've got to make a judgment call on your particular build, which is going to be easier for you to make you tankier to tackle the content that you're going for. Moving on to our cheat sheet that I've been teasing throughout the video discussion today, a couple of numbers to remember. So first off, remember that the max resistance that you're aiming for is 75%, of course, but plus 34% simply because of the way how elemental weakness works and the level that it's at. It's generally not at level 20 when it's getting cast on a player. So this means that if you're at 75% elemental resistances, you can effectively avoid losing any of your max elemental resistances if you're cursed, if you're at whatever 75 plus 34 is, right? 109 percentage overcapped. So you want to see in your character screen 75 without parentheses, and then in parentheses 109 is what you want for each of your elemental resistances. So it's your max resistance plus 34 is what you're looking to be protected and be overcapped from elemental weakness. The second number to remember today is 4%, because each maximum resistance point over 75% is worth roughly 4% elemental damage reduction. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's sometimes a little bit more than 4%, but just remember 4%. Just when you're thinking about getting upgrades, think, is this worth 4% damage reduction in the elemental category? Is this particular upgrade worth it to me in this regard? And is it pushing me towards another threshold where I'll survive another big, massive elemental hit that I'm planning on taking? Of course, all of us are planning on simply avoiding every single hit because we're all such mechanically superior players that we never get hit anyway. So none of us really need elemental resistances at all, right? For those of you that are terrible mechanical players like me, and you're going to get hit, every 4% of elemental damage reduction you can get is an absolute godsend. The third number you need to remember today is, of course, 0 to 4%. Those are the percentages of the maximum amount of resistances that can push you past the cap with purity skills, whether that's purity of fire, purity of ice, or purity of lightning. 0 to 4% is the roll. Of course, you need to be level 20 on the gem in order to get the most benefit out of using the purity skills. The last number to remember today is 90%. 90% is the hard cap for all maximum resistances. This was changed back in 3.6 Synthesis League. That was when GGG said, enough of all of these various immortal builds. We are making it so that way, no matter what, players can only get to 90% on their maximum elemental resistances. You cannot get above that anymore. It is hard-coded into the game. Players can no longer go over 90% elemental resistances at any point in time. Well, thanks so much for watching. What was the highest elemental resistances that you have ever pushed a character to? I've got to admit, back in the day when Pathfinder was broken and we had flasks that gave us max elemental resistances, I toyed around with a couple of different builds that were close to immortal. I never got them to the immortal thresholds that were needed, but we have done a couple of videos that show you what exactly an immortal build looked like back in the old school Path of Exile days, when things like elemental flasks allowed you to push your resistances so high that, yes, there were people that were converting damage and converting elemental resistances and min-maxing their elemental resistances to the point where they simply took 0 damage from elemental sources. Secondly, what are your favorite ways to reduce elemental damage taken? Do you have any favorite items that you like to use? Or is there a particular passive on the tree that you simply always build around? I've got to admit, for me, this league, there are two things that I'm building entire characters around. Every single character that I've made during Blight Hardcore League have been built around these two things. One, can it use Saffrel's Frame? And two, can it go get Soul of Steel? The best builds that I've had that have survived the longest, of course, have been builds that can do both, but I need to be able to use one or the other in order to reduce the amount of elemental damage taken. Of course, armor is great for reducing physical hits, and physical hits are by far the most common source of damage in Path of Exile, but right beside armor and physical hits needed to be mitigated is elemental damage. You've got to figure out a way to reduce elemental damage that your build is going to take. And so for me, I have worked my way pretty much around Barbarism, Survivalist, also once taking Unnatural Calm, but always basically planning around taking Soul of Steel and then trying to figure out other ways to reduce elemental damage taken. I love using the Phoenix Shield whenever I'm playing a Righteous Fire build because that gives you a bunch of additional maximum fire resistance as well. That's another favorite way that I've got for reducing elemental damage taken. Thanks once again for watching, and I hope that today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.